The Iceman cometh! What killed the dinosaurs? The Ice Age! I'm afraid that my condition has left me cold. Do you please...
Stop! No! Just stop it!
Good evening, you Rubenesque Rancors. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, consider supporting me on Patreon, and welcome to the final episode of Game of Thrones Rewrite, aside of course from the finale where we put it all together. Today's subject, or should I say subjects, Bran Stark and the Night King. The connection between Bran and the Night King was built up as the most crucial puzzle piece of the entire series, which would reveal the secret behind Bran's deeper connection with the Three-Eyed Raven and the motivations of the White Walkers as a whole. Season 6 really kicked that shit into gear by introducing a number of game-changing plot developments, and I, for one, was expecting a massive revelation in the coming seasons. But, unfortunately, the show just made the Night King and the Walkers a straight-up antagonistic force who, want to wipe out the world by way of, quote-unquote, destroying the memory of human existence or something, I guess by burning libraries. I don't know. I honestly don't really remember. It seemed like such a throwaway bullshit excuse to give the Night King some sort of motivation. Anyway, despite the absolute letdown that the connection between Bran and the Night King ended up being, based on what was presented in the show, particularly a certain major plot revelation in Season 6, I think I kind of maybe know sort of what the writers were planning on setting up. And today, we are going to use this episode to discuss the conceptual Bran/Night King plot and try to bring it back to life. No pun intended. Forewarning, this episode is low-key about half a rewrite for Bran the Night King and half a rant about something kind of related, but not really. But it's something that has been bugging me for a while, and I really want to get it out there before the end of the series. So just a heads up. Now, before we begin, just a disclaimer. Unfortunately for you book readers, I am probably not going to go into all that much detail as to how the show differs from the books. The last we see of Bran in the books is basically him chilling with the Three-Eyed Raven and tripping on all sorts of crazy smack in order to up his greenside specs. So not only has the biggest revelation of the entire series in terms of implication in my opinion, Hodor's origin story, not yet happened in the books, though it seems likely it will, as it was one of the three big moments that Benioff and Weiss said they were told about by Martin way back when, but the origins and motivations of the White Walkers, or others as they are more often referred to in the book, are probably going to be a lot different in the novels. In the book, the Night King isn't a thing. Well, he kinda is. There's a character named the Night's King, who was the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He ended up bumping uglies with a white lady, and ended up absconding from the Brotherhood. They most likely are not intended to be related in any way whatsoever, and the show writers probably just stole the name for their own character. As for the others themselves, well, they are actually made a much bigger deal in the show than they are in the book. We've only seen them maybe a few times over the course of the entire book series, and it isn't even all that clear what their deal is, or even if they are a straight-up antagonistic force. They are probably going to get a lot of fleshing out, no pun intended, in the Winds of Winter. But anyway, we have a shit ton to go over in this episode, and I don't want to get too caught up with all the little differences between the book and the show. And therefore, the fact that in the books the Three-Eyed Raven is actually a Targaryen bastard by the name of Brynden Rivers, aka Bloodraven, and the ever-popular Jojen paste theory, unfortunately won't be discussed in this video. With all of that said, let's get into Bran's arc in the show. So following Bran Stark taking in a full serving of Wincest, and indulging in a bit of ill-conceived base jumping in the show's pilot, so begins his journey to travel beyond the Wall and meet, and later become, the Three-Eyed Raven, which serves as his main driving force for the first 4 seasons of the show. And he ends up finally getting to the Raven's crib, and then we pick up with the storyline in Season 6. So come Season 6, Bran is being trained by the Three-Eyed Raven in order to improve his green sight, basically the ability to see past, present, and to some extent future events to varying capacity. With this skill of his, Bran is able to look into the past and observe what happened the day that his father and company arrived at the Tower of Joy, where his Aunt Lysa died. To Bran's shock, It turns out that the story of his father Ned Stark besting the great Arthur Dayne was a lie, and Arthur was only defeated due to Howland Reed stabbing him in the back. As Ned makes his way into the tower, Bran calls out to him, and it seems as though Ned is able to hear him. Initially, this makes it seem like Bran is able to influence the past and opens the possibility that he may be able to change it and save the lives of those he loves. But sadly, later in the season, while Bran is visiting the past and sees Hodor as a young man in Winterfell, known then as Willis, the Night King and his army of whites assault the cave of the Three-Eyed Raven. As Myr and Bran make their escape, Hodor holds the door to the cave closed, buying them time. Simultaneously, Bran wargs into Willis in the past and, due to Willis basically experiencing his own death to a certain extent, his mind begins to fracture, resulting in him repeating the last words he shall ever hear before his death, which slowly morphs into the slurred Hodor, Hodor, thus giving Willis his new name. So while it isn't given a full explanation in the show, I am sure many of you are somewhat familiar with this concept due to seeing it in other pieces of media, most likely time travel films, where a character goes back in time to stop a certain event, but inadvertently causes it to happen, thus motivating their future self to go back in time, and so on and so forth. This is a theoretical concept known as a causal loop. So let's use this flat line to demonstrate time moving forward from the past to the future. Over here in the past, we have Willis chilling in the Winterfell courtyard, and over here, in the future, we have Bran chilling in the cave. Bran travels into the past and sees Willis as a young boy. However, due to Hodor being killed by the Whites, this results in the mind of young Willis going haywire, which in turn leads to him growing up into the Hodor we know and love, who joins Bran on his wacky Three-Eyed Raven adventures, which in turn leads to his eventual death beyond the Wall. So this event, Hodor's death, due to Bran's reckless warging, results in the past event, Willis becoming Hodor, which results in Hodor eventually going on to die at the cave. The future event causes the past event, which in turn causes the future event, thus a causal loop. Now I'm sure your next question is, well, hang on, I mean, one of these things must have caused the other one originally, right? Kind of like the whole chicken and the egg problem, one must have come before the other, right? Well, maybe, probably, but it doesn't matter, as there is no possible way for us to know the point at which the loop originated. For example, if I show you a picture of a circle, you can see every single individual point on the circle and how the points all connect to each other. But if I were to ask you to tell me where the beginning of the circle is, well, you can't. There is no way to know how or when this loop came to be. It just is. This circle PNG I got off Google kind of looks familiar, Like we've seen it before multiple times throughout the series. Maybe we will come back to this, but it's probably just a coincidence, right? Anyway, moving on. The concept of cycles and/or history being doomed to repeat itself is a major theme of A Song of Ice and Fire. When it is summer, winter is on the horizon, but every winter must eventually end to make way for summer. Kings rise and fall and are replaced by new kings. Dany likens this process of feudal war to that of a chariot wheel, and claims she wants to break that cycle. However, as we see, she ends up being doomed to fall back into it. Dany and Tyrion's partnership is similar to the very partnership between their fathers, Aerys and Tywin, etc., etc. So why is the Hodor reveal all that big of a deal? And what sort of implications does it hold? Well, as I said, when Bran called out to his father at the Tower of Joy, he thought that, hey, I can change the past and prevent any of this bad shit from happening. But after seeing that his jumping into the past caused certain events to happen, he now realizes that there is no way he can prevent what has already happened or what is to come. He realizes that no matter what he does, no matter how hard he tries to meddle in the past and change the future, it will only result in said future coming to be. He knows everything that has happened and all the horrible things that will happen, and yet he is powerless to stop any of it. And thus the grim truth finally hits him. Bran's knowledge of the past, present, and maybe future doesn't make him a master of time, it makes him a slave to it. And this is what most likely results in his creepy-ass vibe in Season 7 and 8. Bran's weird-ass disposition change isn't really explained in the show, but it makes sense once you've taken into account what we have just discussed. Bran seems rather apathetic and passive. As he says, he no longer wants, and his relationships and feelings towards others seem to be dimmed. Well, consider the knowledge that Bran has. Bran knows that whatever happens, happens, and nothing can change that. Bran doesn't want anymore, because he knows he is going to get what he gets, and hoping and wishing for something isn't going to change that. He most likely doesn't feel fear, since fear is a feeling of dread, of bad things that might happen in the future. But since Bran already knows what is to come, and perhaps is even experiencing the past, present, and future simultaneously, he doesn't fear the future, since he already knows how everything is going to play out, or at the very least, there is no use in fretting over what is already set in stone. For those of you who are familiar with the character Dr. Manhattan from the graphic novel Watchmen, a man who experiences time in a non-linear fashion, and thus sort of all at once, I think you can sort of understand what I am getting at, and what the writers tried to do. Now before we move on, there is something we need to discuss about Bran's knowledge, as it will be essential to our rewrite. We know Bran seems to have the ability to look into the past and knows everything that is currently happening. But a question remains. Is Bran able to see the future? The answer to this question is never presented in the show, but I would argue that by season 7, Bran is in fact able to see into the future, at least to some extent. Evidence supporting this would be the fact that Jojen Reed was said to have known his own fate when he reached the cave of the Three-Eyed Raven. Upon leaving the cave after the Night King's attack, Bran has a flash of the Sept of Baelor blowing up, an event that takes place sometime later on, although there is some debate to the chronological order of the show's events. And in season 8, Bran seems to know exactly where and when Jaime will arrive at Winterfell. Again, it is never confirmed, but I would argue that there is enough evidence to strongly suggest that Bran can see the future and knows everything that is to come. Again, at least to some extent. But of course, this leads to another dangling question. If Bran can see into the future, then why doesn't he use his foresight to warn his homies of all the bad shit that ends up happening? He could have used his knowledge to help the Northerners strategize their fight against the Night King. He could have forewarned them about Euron's attack on their fleet, which resulted in Rhaegal's death. He could have been like, hey, Jon, so you know how you planned on telling that dragon chick about you also being a Targ? Yeah, you may want to hold off on doing that for like maybe a couple weeks. Well, the answer to this we've already sort of touched on. Bran knows that whatever is to come is set in stone, and there's nothing he can do to change it. No matter what he tries to do to change the future, he will only end up inadvertently causing it to happen, and thus, he tries to stay out of crap as much as possible. Another possible theory is that Bran has seen every possible future outcome and is purposefully leaving his family and friends in the dark in order to ensure the best possible outcome. Perhaps he has seen a future where he tells Jon and the others that Dany is going to go cuckoo banana pancakes, but it only results in them trying to take her out, which leads to her killing not only everyone in King's Landing, but Jon, Sansa, Arya, and the rest. This is because Bran knows that if he tells certain characters certain future events, that they will then act differently than they would have had he not told them. And this brings us to our second theoretical concept we will discuss today, one that is an offshoot from the causal loop and is commonly referred to as the self-fulfilling prophecy. This is a concept in which a character is told something will happen in the future. Because of this, the character tries to prevent that future event from happening, or acts a certain way, but it is in fact this attempt to stop the future from happening that results in it ultimately occurring.
And don't worry about the vase.
What vase?
That vase. What's really going to bake your noodle later on is, would you still have broken it if I hadn't said anything?
This is a thematic concept that is old as heckin' balls, my dude. When the Greek god Kronos learned that one of his own sons was destined to overthrow him, he began eating his own newborn children to prevent this from happening, which in turn led to one of his children, Zeus, may have heard of him, who was able to be rescued pre-papa consumption, who, in response to his father eating his siblings, decides to overthrow him. Oedipus Rex learns from an oracle that he is destined to kill his own father. Wanting to avoid this, he flees his home and travels to the city of Thebes. On his way to Thebes, Oedipus kills some random old man on the road, who is later revealed to be his father. But no better piece of media has utilized the concept of the self-fulfilling prophecy better than what is undoubtedly, unquestionably, unarguably the greatest television series of all time.
Let's go. You could gaze into the future. You might think life would be
Disney Channel's 2003 subversive and revolutionary masterpiece, That's So Raven, the most artistically refined television program in history, seconded only by its audacious follow-up, Cory in the House, uses the self-fulfilling prophecy motif in its most brilliant and nuanced form. Raven Baxter is a psychic. She has visions of future events. Due to said visions, in order to prevent them from coming true, as they often would spell disaster if they indeed did, Raven takes a number of countermeasures in order to ensure her intended future never comes to fruition. But in true tragic literary fashion, Raven's attempts to avoid her fate are often in vain, as they are the very actions that lead to her sullen, inevitable, foretold destination. Do I think that it's realistic that Raven is apparently so dense that she doesn't realize that every single time she tries to prevent her visions from coming true, it only leads to said visions coming true? Specifically thanks to her concentrated efforts to prevent said visions from coming true? Look, I'm not here to apply an overabundance of logic to a network that thought it was totally cool to make an original film aimed at children that basically implies that all Irish people are leprechauns. Anyway, in addition to the theme of cycles, reincarnation, history repeating itself, etc., we also see the motif of the self-fulfilling prophecy featured in Martin's fantasy series, primarily through the character arc of Cersei Lannister. Per her episode, as we know, when Cersei was a young girl, she visited the forest witch known as Maggie the Frog, who told her that she would have 3 children and that they would all die. It was due to this forewarning that Cersei became the paranoid psycho bitch we all know and love, which in turn, at least in the show, leads to all of her children dying, thus proving Maggie's prediction correct. And thus, the looming question is, of course, if Cersei had never gone to see Maggie that day in the forest, would all of her children still be alive to this day? Just something to fry your noodle for the time being. Okay. You droned on about causal loops and self-fulfilling prophecies and ethnically insensitive family programming for too long, my dude. What the fuck is the point of all of this in Bran the Night King's episode? Well, it has to do with that very controversial claim I mentioned at the conclusion of last episode, one that would basically put everything we know about our particular hot-blooded family into question. Okay, so I'm about to present a question, and when I ask it, you may be a bit confused as to why I'm asking something that is basically crystal clear in both the novels and the show. But just bear with me because we are going to discuss it. Some of you who may be familiar with the number of theories regarding Bran the Night King may have some idea as to where this is going, but alas, that question is, what caused Aerys Targaryen II, aka the Mad King, to go mad? Well, what do you mean? I mean, he's a Targ. Targaryen madness, the Tane or whatever, something, flip of a coin, and whatnot. Of course he went super hardcore psycho. He was always destined to. Wasn't he? Well, let's talk about Aerys. Though he is one of the most prominent figures of the series, he is seldom spoken of outside of the context of all the crazy ass shit he pulled. But let's do a quick rewind and give a little background on our favorite crazy ass Targ. As a young man, Aerys was actually pretty chill. And dare I say, even charismatic. Sure, when he took the throne, he talked a big game and never really followed through on a lot of the proposals he had originally sought out to accomplish, but all in all, he was considered a magnanimous and all-around well-liked and respected ruler. However, charisma is clearly not the only thing that makes a great king. In order for a reign to be successful, you need to deliver. And that is where Aerys' right-hand man, Big Daddy Tywin, came into the picture. Tywin, though most would call him abrasive, was a master strategist, and under his watch, the economy and atmosphere of the Seven Kingdoms was boomin'. Despite Tywin's excellent work, Aerys became resentful of his closest friend and hand, seeing that due to Tywin being such a baller behind the scenes, most considered him the true ruler of the Seven Kingdoms. In addition to this, the friendship between Aerys and Tywin was strained even further when one Joanna Lannister entered the picture. It seems to be implied, though I don't think ever confirmed, that Joanna and Aerys had bumped uglies when they were younger. Aerys made some lewd comments to Tywin at his and Joanna's reception, implying that he wanted to smash. Whether Aerys did this to just stick it to Tywin as a petty move, or perhaps he was indeed jealous as he truly felt for, or at least lusted after Joanna, or maybe he just meant it as a complete frat boy-esque drunken joke, isn't exactly certain. But what is certain is that this little tiff between the two buds was one that Tywin would never forget. The relationship continued to sour over the years, with Aerys refusing to listen to Tywin's counsel. Talk that Tywin was the one in charge of the land continued to get under Aerys' skin. So much so that he ended up taking the tongue of Ilyn Payne when he said something of the like. Aerys ended up marrying his sister Rhaella, but was known to fuck around more than just a little bit. He and his sister tried to conceive in order to produce an heir for the throne, but sadly, all of their attempts ended as miscarriages or stillborns, or with the child only surviving at most just under a year. As time went on, and they continued to fail to produce a child, Ares started to get suspicious that Rhaella was being unfaithful, and that it was not he who was not able to produce an heir. Not that that makes any lick of sense. When Rhaella gave birth to a son who it seemed was in good health and would survive indefinitely, it seemed like Ares' temper and cruelness began to subside. But when said child died about a year later, Ares was so enraged that he beheaded the wet nurse and ended up torturing and executing his mistress at the time, along with her whole family. Oh, well, this is where the Targ rage finally showed itself, right? Where he finally let the dragon out? Well, no, not exactly. While this was no doubt fucked up, Ares actually ended up repenting for what he did by making a walk of penance to the Sept of Baelor, only to return to Rhaella and promise he would be faithful to her from now on, a promise he surprisingly kept. The next year, Viserys was born, and though Ares was happy, he was also insanely protective of him, fearful that someone would try to kill his newborn son. So let's just stop there and discuss what we just went over. So, as we saw, Ares actually seemed like a pretty decent dude before and even towards the beginning of his reign. His friendship with Tywin did start to disintegrate pretty quickly, but given the context, Ares being a cocky kid who felt as if he was being undermined by his own subjects, I don't necessarily think this is all that out there. Even when he would go on to cut out Ilyn Payne's tongue for saying it was Tywin who ruled the Seven Kingdoms, while this does seem rather extreme, remember that we can't view Westerosi law and order through our current lens. In this society, something as innocuous as pickpocketing could lead to the punishment of losing your whole goddamn hand. And consider that Ilyn Payne was the head of Tywin's guard, while he served as the hand of the king. So it's not as if he was just some rando on the street. Ilyn Payne saying such a thing, considering his position, was incredibly uncalled for and inappropriate. With this in mind, the punishment he received doesn't seem super out there. But then there is of course Ares' growing paranoia following the deaths of his children, and the eventual beheading of the wet nurse and execution of his mistress and her family. Now, I am not excusing any of this, but also take into account the toll of losing 7 children. George R.R. Martin has spoken about the influence of European history on his series, most notably the War of the Roses in the 15th century. I wonder if Ares losing so many children to miscarriage and stillbirth was a reference to Queen Anne of Great Britain, who was portrayed by Olivia Colman in the film The Favourite, who lost a whopping 17 children over the course of her lifetime, most of them due to miscarriages and stillborns. And as shown in the film, it took quite the mental toll on her. Of course, executing a bunch of innocent people is extreme to the extreme, but when you consider the fact that Ares had always had a hot temper, most likely felt inadequate next to Tywin, most likely felt pressure to produce an heir to his house, well, again, I am not excusing it, but it seems like there is some more going on than just him being intrinsically CBP. This is even further supported by the fact that not only did the birth of his son seem to bring Ares out of his paranoia and malice for several months, but even after his son died and he killed the wet nurse and his mistress and her family, Ares repented and even honored his wife by pledging fidelity. Whoa. Okay, look, even if we buy that maybe Ares' behavior up until this point seems like it could possibly have been brought about more by a myriad of other factors as opposed to simply madness, the very next year, the Defiance of Duskendale happened, which you yourself said was the event that made Ares the monster that would go on to bring terror to the Seven Kingdoms. And you are correct. A year after the birth of Viserys, that was when, per Varys' episode, Ares was taken captive by Lord Dennis Darklyn, and held captive for several months. Upon his release, Ares laid waste to House Darklyn, and thus the man who we would know to come as the Mad King truly reared his head. So yeah, even though Ares may have been able to quell his madness to some extent before the Defiance, it was the trauma and mental deterioration he suffered while being held captive for several months, believing his hand Lord Tywin and even his own son Rhaegar may have conspired against him, that led him to go full-on CBP. I mean, sure, that does seem to make sense, and it's definitely plausible. It's just that, well, when you actually look into the details of the Defiance, well, there's something a bit off about it. I'm not talking about the numerous theories as to what caused the Defiance itself, or what may have been going on behind the scenes in regards to rescuing Ares, or not, mind you. I'm talking about the fact that, while the Defiance is perhaps the most significant and cataclysmic event in Westerosi history that led to the end of the entire Targaryen dynasty due to Ares finally losing his mind, well, for all of its importance, we actually have no idea what the hell happened to Ares during his imprisonment. I mean, that's kind of weird, right? Like, this is the event that led to Ares becoming perhaps the most cruel and psychotic leader ever to sit the Iron Throne, and we are given basically no insight into what trauma he faced while imprisoned. I mean, sure, he was probably humiliated and was left alone with his own paranoia for several months, but was he, like, tortured, beaten? I don't know, something? Was he treated well by the Darklands? Poorly? Forced to watch reruns of Two Broke Girls? There is literally zero information on this. It's a little weird, right? And even if you think that maybe he just sat there in his own shit for 6 months, and that was enough to drive him psycho, also consider his actions following his release. Not so much him killing all of the members of House Darkland and Hollard, as we discussed in Varys' episode, but specifically the death of Dennis Darkland's wife, Lady Sarala. Per Varys' episode, Lady Sarala was given the most heinous death of all, being burned alive after her tongue and womanly parts were torn out. Lady Sarala kind of got a shit deal. Even years after the Defiance, the remaining people of Duskendale were convinced she was the one who seduced Lord Darkland into taking Ares captive. There is absolutely zero evidence for this, and most likely is simply a case of rampant xenophobia, considering she was Mirish. But why did Ares single her out for such a horrible punishment, considering we have no idea if they even exchanged so much as a glance? Some theories attest that, given the nature of Ares' infliction upon her, Sarala sexually assaulted the king during his captivity, though, once again, there is literally no evidence to support this. Dude, what the fuck? What are you trying to say? That Ares wasn't actually as mad as people say he was? No, he was definitely full-on mega CBP, and even though I do find the lack of details as to what Ares endured during the Defiance a bit odd, given his history and disposition before the Defiance, and his soured relationship with Tywin, I think this is enough to explain Ares' descent into madness. However, while I am in no way saying that Ares was not mad, I am saying that I don't believe he had any more of an inclination towards madness than anyone else would have in the exact same situation. Which brings me to that controversial theory that I spoke of earlier regarding the Targaryens, specifically Targaryen madness. And that theory is that the idea of Targaryen madness isn't actually a thing. So, as we all know, the idea of inherent madness being a trait that seems to run the blood of the Targaryens is one that is widely held throughout the land of Westeros and beyond, and is brought up and referenced and noted all the goddamn time. But I would argue that there is next to no evidence to support this idea, or at the very least, there is not nearly enough to make any sort of judgment call whatsoever. First of all, consider some of the rather silly things that people say when in reference to Targaryen madness. Perhaps the silliest being,
They say every time a Targaryen is born, the gods toss a coin, and the world holds its breath.
well, that seems like a pretty low bar to set, right? So every Targaryen has a propensity for madness, but it only presents itself in certain cases? But isn't this true for, like, everyone and every family in the damn world? I mean, there were some pretty chill Lannisters, and then there were some pretty not chill Lannisters. The Bolton line isn't exactly free of antisocial tendencies. I'm sure if you looked at almost every family in Westerosi history, there are probably a handful of psychos somewhere in the bloodline. Well, yeah, but the Targaryen line obviously had a notably higher inclination towards madness, hence why they came to be known for it. Of course they did. But did they, though? So, from the day Aegon the Conqueror created the Iron Throne, to the day Jaime Lannister killed the Mad King Aerys, a total of 17 Targaryens ruled the Seven Kingdoms. There were great kings, bad kings, love kings, and incompetent kings. But aside from Aerys, how many of them could be said to have been quote-unquote mad? Like, maybe 3 or 4. Like, maybe. There was Maegor, who was definitely a sick fuck, but calling him mad, at least in the same sense as Ares, may be a bit of a stretch. He was definitely cruel and sadistic, but not really to the point where he had a complete disconnect from reality. There was Aegon II, who did some pretty questionable crap. However, also keep in mind that Aegon was the king at the time of the famous conflict that is known as the Dance of the Dragons. So it wasn't exactly a time free of tension and turmoil. There was Baelor the Blessed, who definitely was a bit cuckoo, but it's pretty clear that this was as a result of his religious fundamentalism, rather than some inherited madness. And then there was Aegon V, who had a pretty decent reign, which ended in tragedy when he died trying to hatch dragon eggs, which in turn led to the tragedy at Summerhall. But also keep in mind, he had attempted to do so in order to quell a number of rebellions that were sprouting up across the land at the time. And Aegon believed the use of dragons was the only way to bring peace. And that is just the men who ruled the realm. If we extend our purview to the entire Targaryen lineage, the madness ratio becomes even lower. Sure, a dude like Aeron Targaryen was pretty damn cruel and could be considered quote-unquote mad, but then there are some where you really have to reach to consider. There was Helaena Targaryen, who was said to have gone mad and later committed suicide after the death of her son, which is totally understandable, considering she was forced to pick one of her 3 children to die, picked her youngest son, but then the killers killed her other son, and then she had to live with the fact that she literally picked her living son to be killed. Come to think of it, she was also the wife of Aegon II, so perhaps the circumstances of the death of his son also led him to do some pretty fucked up shit. And then there was Prince Rhaegal, who was only deemed crazy because he was seen dancing bare-assed in the Red Keep, which is something I do in my kitchen on the reg, despite my roommate's repeated irritated emails. Wait, but what about Viserys? I mean, he was cocky and sadistic and convinced he was practically the Messiah, but he wasn't necessarily mad, unless we are using the term mad as more of an umbrella term for a number of antisocial behaviors. Also, if you take into account that he was forced to flee his home after his entire bloodline was basically wiped from the earth, and then spent the next decade and a half being pampered to and told he was the hottest shit ever and was destined to one day reclaim the throne in the name of his fallen ancestors, yeah, I could see that making a dude a bit abrasive. With all that said, I'd argue that the idea that the Targaryens have a particularly higher propensity for madness is complete and utter bullshit. So why is this a thing? Well, probably for a number of reasons. Consider that before the reign of Robert Baratheon, the Targaryens were basically the bloodline of the Seven Kingdoms, being the absolute and only rulers of the land. I think it is reasonable to assume they were put under a bit more of a microscope than anyone else. Also consider, even in the cases where we could say that a particular Targ king was mad, it may have just been a byproduct of being an absolute ruler and all the trials and tribulations that come with such a position. Even the wiki on Targ madness seems to allude to this. It must be observed that of the Targaryen kings who ruled Westeros for almost 300 years, only Aerys could be considered truly mad. Several princes and bastards of Targaryen blood committed insane acts for one reason or another, and oftentimes it was not quote-unquote pure madness, but acts born out of desperation or arrogance that led to further tragedies. And this idea goes along with the literal biggest draw of the entire series, especially in the books, that most of the main characters are not wholly good or bad, but are simply at the mercy of their circumstances. And while you may not agree with their particular actions, given the full context of said circumstances, you are able to empathize with their decisions at any particular moment. I don't necessarily like the person Tyrion becomes after he flees across the Narrow Sea in the books, but god damn it, do I fucking get it. Something also to consider is the presence, or lack thereof, of context in regard to understanding the actions of these so-called mad Targaryens. As we see at the beginning of the series, based on the perspective of King Robert Baratheon, Rhaegar Targaryen was an evil monster who kidnapped the poor and helpless Lyanna Stark, a perception that is completely BTFO'd as the series goes on, and we understand the context of the events surrounding Robert's rebellion. Maybe he wasn't a perfect angel, but obviously things are more complicated than they had first seemed. There is also the matter of the old adage, history is written by the victors. Consider that when the series begins, it has been a whole 2 decades since the Mad King was slain, and thus 20 years of hearsay and rumors and retelling stories with, once again, a lack of crucial context and an obvious anti-Targ bias. Of course history will be warped and reshapen based on the predilections of those who control the narrative. Hell, look at how differently we see Jaime as a person after we add a single piece of information to the tale of him slaying the Mad King. Something else to take into account that may explain the prevalence of the Targaryen madness theory is the fact that the actions of Aerys have in a way tainted the entire Targaryen lineage. Given just how fucking nuts Aerys went, and the most likely intense collective trauma that his insane acts inflicted upon the people of Westeros, this may have resulted in a level of uncharitability in looking back on the history of the Targaryens. Could it be possible that Maegor, in addition to having a generally sadistic disposition that plenty of other characters are shown to have, wasn't necessarily crazy, but simply became drunk on power due to the immense responsibility and weight of ruling an entire kingdom? Nah, he's just a crazy Targ. Perhaps Helaena Targaryen ended up taking her own life due to the depression and trauma that sprouted from the horrific choice she was forced to make regarding the lives of her children, something that I feel would not be all that surprising for any parent regardless of their bloodline. Yeah, but whatever, she's just a crazy Targ bitch. Maybe Rhaegal just liked chilling with his dick out for his own amusement, like a certain lisping derivative YouTube commentator. Or perhaps he was suffering from some sort of mental disorder the people of Westeros would not have had any knowledge of at the time. No, crazy, he's just a nutty boy. And all of that isn't even taking into account the negative effects of inbreeding, something that the Targs were huge proponents of, or the theory that the Faith Militant, who had tried to overthrow the Targaryen dynasty way back when, it turns out that this attempted coup happened during Maegor's reign. Oh, look at that, more context. Had exacerbated the theory of Targaryen madness in order to not only taint the Targaryen name, but also to try and further discourage the practice of incest, as it obviously was against their beliefs. And now we arrive at Daenerys Targaryen. I've spoken before in this series how the books in particular framed Dany, via her inner monologue, as a bit more unstable and rash than her show counterpart. And perhaps I, and many others, could, based on the continuous harping on about Targaryen madness by other characters, attribute this to the taint in her bloodline. Her killing the slavers of Astapor, the nobles of Meereen, the Khals of Vaes Dothrak? She's nuts, my dude. Except, as we know, when put into context, even though we may not agree with Dany's methods, and perhaps she does act a bit rash, we can at least to some extent understand her reasoning at the time. But without said context, these actions done by Dany can easily be completely and utterly misinterpreted as the acts of a complete psycho. Again, while we may not agree or may be concerned a bit by Dany's actions, consider she is a 13-year-old girl who has been given pretty much total and complete power via her dragons, with everyone around her singing her praises and telling her of her destiny to return to her homeland and avenge her entire bloodline. Are we that surprised that she may not be the most stable and reasoned individual? And now let's tie this in with the theme of the self-fulfilling prophecy. It is said that while Dany had heard stories about her father, the Mad King, and his atrocious acts, she didn't necessarily believe them and figured they were greatly exaggerated. That is until said acts are confirmed by Barristan in A Storm of Swords. It is here that Dany begins to second-guess herself and fears that she may be going mad herself, and decides to stay in Meereen to prove that she is not like her father. So already the picture is beginning to become clear. What if Dany is not mad at all, but the constant and insistent comments regarding the possibility that she is a ticking time bomb eventually drive her up the wall and convince her that maybe she is actually a total psycho? Imagine if for her entire campaign to Westeros, all she hears is, "Don't go nuts, Dany. Don't go crazy. Don't end up like your father. Don't do it. We know you probably want to kill everyone because you're a cuckoo banana pancakes bitch. Don't do it. Don't do it, you crazy Targ motherfucker." I'm sure this would in of itself start to drive anyone a little bit nuts. And this is probably going to factor into Dany's decision to go ham on King's Landing in the conclusion of the book series. Per my theory, I have a feeling that Dany is going to roll up to King's Landing to take the throne, only to find Fagon and the Dornish have beat her to it. Dany will then see a lot of her top aides try to convince her to take a knee, and if she won't, they may abscond to the away team. Dany will then have every single thing she has done throughout the series thrown in her fucking face. Fagon will tell the people of King's Landing of the slavers of Astapor, the nobles of Meereen, everything that she has done in the pursuit of a better world will be put into the worst possible light, and she will be branded as the demon spawn of her psychotic father. And when it comes time to take what is hers, the only thing that Dany will be thinking in that moment, "You motherfuckers want the Mad Queen? Well, here she fucking comes." Perhaps if all those people who constantly talked about her possibly going mad had kept their damn mouths shut, it wouldn't have built up and up in her mind until it finally explodes in the end when she is finally pushed too far. And thus, we see the self-fulfilling prophecy coming full circle. In the Mad King's case, despite his disposition before he went mad and all the important and crucial context that led to said madness, all of that is forgotten and he is simply remembered as one nutty boy. And with Dany, when the series comes to a close and Dany most likely turns King's Landing to ash, will the people ask themselves why this happened? Will they take into account everything that Dany has been through and faced and overcome? Will they consider she was forced to flee her homeland after the evisceration of her entire bloodline? Will they consider the loss of her husband and son? Will they consider the fact that she freed slaves all across the land? Will they consider she truly tried to do it right and rule as a magnanimous queen? Will they consider that in the end, when it finally came time to reclaim the throne, she saw the very people who extinguished her bloodline call her mad, a psycho, a demon, and the people who pledged themselves to her disavow her and perhaps even betray her? Will the people remember the amazing, complicated, magnanimous, temperamental, compassionate, loving woman we came to know over the course of the series? Or, in the end, after she is killed, due to the lie of Targaryen madness, will all of her pain and suffering and turmoil be disregarded as her actions are chalked up to a non-existent taint of her blood? Sadly, like her father, in the end, this incredible, three-dimensional woman will simply be remembered as the Mad Queen. But of course, this is all just a theory. I know that was a bit of a tangent, but it is something that I have wanted to discuss about the series for a while, and I will tie this back in a little bit once we get towards the end of Bran's arc. So let's get back to him. So as I said, Season 6 introduces the concept of the causal loop, and shows Bran that despite his ability to see into the past, present, and maybe future, it is all for naught. As he understands, he is completely powerless to stop what is to come, and must simply allow it to unfold. With that said, I would keep Bran's arc all the way up through Season 6 completely intact. Now on to Season 7. Season 7's a little tricky, since Bran is more or less sidelined for the whole Sansa and Arya plot. Per Sansa's episode, rather than her being fooled by Littlefinger to turn against Arya only to be saved by Bran's foresight at the 2-minute buzzer, Sansa will immediately catch on to Littlefinger's plan and spend Season 7 concocting a plan of her own to eliminate him. So what does that leave Bran to do? Basically the exact same thing he does in the show. Just sit around and act weird and show off his lack of any sort of social skills any chance he can. Bran's significance will be far more paramount in Season 8, so Season 7 is more or less a waiting game, offering hints as to what his whole creepy-ass deal is. However, the big change we need to make in Season 7 is to give this bad bitch some justice.
Hey.
Mira Reed was a ride-or-die OG, my dude. She was with Bran through thick and thin, stuck by him even after she lost her brother, and lugged his ass halfway across a tundra, and when it came time to say goodbye, gave her a farewell that was the emotional equivalent of leaving her on red. Honestly, I don't even know how I felt about Mira leaving the way she did. It makes sense that she would want to be with her family, considering Jojen's death, but at the same time, I figured she would want to get some up-close and personal satisfaction by helping the Northerners take down the Whites. Either way, it's fine. I'd probably like Mira around because she is pimp as fuck, and by having her by Bran's side, she can sort of act as his own personal PR and explain away all the inappropriate shit he says. Or if she does want to depart, I at the very least give them a tearful and appreciative goodbye. That can be another communal decision we make in the end. But now on to Season 8, where Bran's arc starts to get interesting. So Bran won't do much in Episode 1. Most likely he'll just sit around and be awkward as holy fuck. But Episode 2, we'll see Jaime arrive, who then informs Dany about Cersei totally not helping them out in their fight against the Night King. Still a bit wary of Jaime, we will see him imprisoned by Dany. During Episode 2, Jaime will be visited by a number of other characters, namely Tyrion, maybe Arya, but most definitely Bran. Like in the show, Jaime will apologize to Bran for what he did to him in the pilot, but Bran pays it no mind, as he tells Jaime it was what needed to occur and nothing either of them did could have changed it. When Jaime asks Bran what the hell is the deal with the Night King, Bran tells him that the Night King is coming solely for him. But we aren't going to go with all that dumb memory of humanity or whatever. When Jaime asks Bran why the Night King is coming for him, Bran says he doesn't know. He tells Jaime he has seen how the conflict with the Night King will end, but he still is not able to understand why the Night King is coming for him. Bran does, however, offer Jaime a chance to make up for what he did to him if he truly wishes to repent. Jaime agrees, and Bran asks him to be his defender in the Godswood during the Night King's assault, instead of Theon as in the show. Jaime is skeptical of his fighting skills, but Bran assures him that Jaime will do just fine. And now on to the Long Night battle. Things will go as they do in the show, with the Whites going ham and overrunning Winterfell without all that much of a struggle. In the Godswood, Jaime, along with a number of others, will defend Bran from the incoming Whites. We see Jaime fight harder than he ever has, knowing that this is his one chance to redeem himself to Bran. But despite this, eventually the Whites are able to gain the upper hand. It is here that the Night King reveals himself and prepares to take Bran out. Jaime stands tall, ready to face the Night King, but Bran tells him that that is enough for now and that he cannot stop what is to come. When Jaime turns to ask Bran what crazy ass shit he's talking about now, Bran momentarily wargs into Jaime, causing him to pass out. With Jaime incapacitated, the Night King makes his way towards Bran. Now before we get to our finale, let's talk about our boy Blue. So as I stated before, the Night King, as he is presented in the show, is not a character from the books, as of yet anyway, but most likely won't be making an appearance. He was basically developed to give a sort of figurehead to the antagonistic force that is the White Walkers. Again, a little weird considering that I have a feeling that we will learn that there is a lot more to the others rather than just being zombie fodder, but I digress. Since he first made his debut, the Night King's motivations were completely shrouded in mystery. I mean, he obviously wanted to fuck some shit up, but I think most fans had a feeling that there was more to his story, and that his intentions were deeper or more complicated than just killing Bran's rude and ungrateful ass. And thus our disappointment when he ended up just being evil who wanted to kill Bran cause memory or something. Now, if you were a frequent fan theory enthusiast such as myself, you've probably heard more than a few theories regarding the connection between Bran and the Night King, since they seem to have some sort of deeper bond. One of the most prominent theories is, of course, that they are in fact one and the same. At some point, Bran traveled into the past and perhaps warged into the man who would become the Night King, and thus he has been pursuing himself the entire series. And this is what I think the writers were trying to set up. Honestly, it's really the only explanation I can think of in regard to explaining their deeper connection. This is a smaller iteration of a much bigger and more complex theory, stating that not only is Bran the Night King, but he is also a number of other characters throughout the legend of Westeros. Most notably, Bran the Builder, a Stark ancestor who was said to have constructed the Castle of Winterfell and the wall itself. Bran travels into the past to ensure that certain events take place, namely the creation of the Night King, the construction of Winterfell, and the wall going up. He would do so by becoming these very individuals. The problem is, we really have no idea how the hell any of this works, because the show barely gets into the mechanics of how Bran's time jumping and warging works. Like, we know that if he wargs and time jumps at the same time, some fucky shit can happen, but how would this lead to him becoming other people throughout time? We know that he cannot change the past, but he can clearly have some effect on it, most likely in the form of making sure certain people do certain things. But this doesn't really explain how he could literally become a completely different person. Like maybe by warging and getting stuck, but then what would happen to future Bran? This is basically the reason I think the writers ended up scrapping this whole idea. They probably had something in mind regarding the Bran the Night King connection and them being the same person to some extent, but they kind of got lost in the logistics of it and just scrapped it in the final season. I even tried to spin it in a way to make it work for this rewrite, but even I couldn't think of a way to make it work. In any case, I didn't want to go with them being the same dude anyway, so it's a moot point. While we are not going with Bran the Night King being the same person, we are going to give them a deeper connection, which has to do with how Bran can influence the past, not to change the future, but to ensure that it unfolds as it should. So now let's go back to the end of the Long Night. With Jaime passed out in the snow and no one else there to protect him, Bran awaits his fate as the Night King stalks toward him. The Night King towers over Bran, and Bran merely looks at him, not afraid, as he knows how this conflict will end. But one question remains. Bran asks the Night King, why? Why has he come all this way to kill him? It is then that the Night King reaches out and puts his hand on Bran's shoulder, and Bran, and we the audience, finally understand. As upon the Night King touching Bran, we see the day the Night King was created, when Leaf plunged the dragonglass dagger into his chest. Except when Bran visits this moment, instead of seeing Leaf plunging the dagger into his chest, Leaf and the other children of the forest don't know what to do with the man they have captured. Bran waits for them to plunge the dagger into his chest, but it just doesn't happen. And that is when Bran finally understands. Bran then either uses his whisper power or wargs into Leaf and does what must be done. It is then revealed that it was in fact Bran who either gave the children of the forest the idea to create the Night King or warged into Leaf and did it himself. Bran realizes that all of the chaos that has befallen his home due to the Whites was in fact his own doing. The dagger is then plunged into the man's chest, and just as he turns into the Night King, the first man looks up to see Bran standing among the children of the forest just before he turns, similar to how Willis seemed to be able to see Bran right before his mind went haywire. Back in Winterfell, we finally now see why the Night King was so adamant about hunting down the very boy who turned him into the monster that he is, and we understand Bran's grim acceptance of the fact that he now knows that every death as a result of him creating the Night King lays at his feet. Bran apologizes to the Night King, saying he didn't have a choice in the matter, but what's done is done. As the Night King unsheathes his sword and raises it above his head, ready to deliver the killing blow to Bran, we see Bran's eyes roll back, warging into someone, but who? And just then, the tip of Widow's wail pierces the Night King's chest, and we reveal Jaime Lannister, currently under the control of Bran, gripping the sword's hilt, followed by the Night King and the rest of the Whites bursting into pieces. Upon being released by Bran and regaining consciousness, Jaime comes to, finding himself standing above the shattered pieces of the Night King. He looks to Bran in shock, to which Bran responds only by a simple nod of the head. And for the second time in his life, Jaime Lannister has become a Kingslayer, once again to save every living soul of the realm. Now Bran doesn't do all that much in the show beyond this point, rather than just sit around and get the top seat at the very end, cause storytelling something whatever. But as we know, for our rewrite, Jon will end up becoming king with Bran as his hand. However, there's one more thing I would like to add. Following Dany burning King's Landing to a crisp, the series finale begins. As we know in our rewrite finale, Tyrion will kill Dany in order to make penance for his misdeeds, which will lead to Jon being named king after executing Tyrion to bring peace to the realm. But for our rewrite, as Dany's impending assassination by Tyrion is set in motion in the finale, something else will be going on miles away. Back in Winterfell, Sansa will visit Bran in his chambers. After a moment, Sansa will realize something is wrong, and Bran informs her of the events that have just played out in King's Landing. As Sansa rushes to tell the others, Bran says to go on without him, as there is one final thing he must ensure. After Sansa departs, we see Bran take one final trip into the past. Bran comes to in a dark stone-walled room. No lights, only the sound of dripping water, which is then followed by the sound of weak coughing. Bran turns and walks into the darkness, approaching something he can barely make out. But as he approaches the weak and mangled man shackled to the wall of the prison cell, Bran knows exactly who he's looking at. King Aerys Targaryen II, known as the Mad King. Bran has entered Aerys' prison cell at Duskendale after the beginning of the Defiance. It is here that Bran realizes what he must do. Bran begins to speak to Aerys via his whisper chat. It was said that Aerys was driven mad due to hearing whispers no one else could hear. Aerys panics, wondering where the voice is coming from. Bran begins to fill Aerys' head with delusions of paranoia and betrayal. Tywin Lannister and his own son conspiring against him. Perhaps Bran even says that it was Sarala who ordered his captivity, or maybe Bran even wargs into her at some point during his imprisonment to torture or taunt him, which would explain the treatment she received following his rescue. Slowly we see Bran drive Aerys madder and madder and madder, knowing full well that in doing so, he has effectively sealed the fates of his grandfather Rickard and Uncle Brandon, as well as his own father's death, and the deaths of his mother and brother, and the eventual destruction of King's Landing. But as we know, he doesn't have a choice. Very similar to the choice that Jon must make in the show finale, Duty Over Love, Bran must perform his duty even though it comes at the cost of losing so many he cares for. This theory, that Bran was in fact the one who drove Aerys over the edge during his imprisonment at Duskendale, is one that has been floating around for a while, and seems to explain why perhaps we have a dearth of information regarding what exactly Aerys was subjected to during the Defiance, and his massive heel turn is as a result of Bran driving him insane. Another theory proposes that perhaps the reason Aerys became so obsessed with Wildfire following the Defiance was because Bran told him of the eventual White Walker threat, and Aerys, being fearful of them, surrounded himself with Wildfire in order to fight against them, the same Wildfire he nearly used to burn his own citizens. Another theory proposes that Bran had actually warged into Aerys the moment he decided to burn the citizens of King's Landing at the end of the rebellion. This is supported by the fact that Jaime says Aerys kept repeating, "Burn them all, right before he killed them," which sounds oddly familiar to Willis saying "hold the door" over and over again before he became Hodor. Perhaps Bran warged into Aerys at this moment at the same time that the White Walkers attacked Winterfell, and someone yelling "burn them all," which would be in reference to them burning the White Walkers, was overheard by Aerys himself, which is why he repeats it incessantly moments before his death. But of course, these are all just theories. I really like, at the very least, the idea of Bran being the one who pushed Aerys to the edge during his imprisonment at Duskendale, as it really fits in with the inevitability of the future and events being set in stone. Again, we can bang out the exact details before the finale. Following Tyrion killing Dany, Jon is of course crowned king with Bran as his hand. In the final scene of the series, Jon takes his place on the Iron Throne with Bran by his side. The only ones in the cavernous throne room are the two of them. Jon and Bran have a final conversation about all that has happened, and as we see in the show, Jon tells Bran that he's sorry he was not there when he needed him, but Bran responds he was exactly where he needed to be, an answer that takes on a whole new meaning considering how we have explained Bran's capabilities. Jon then asks Bran if he knows what is to come, to which Bran says yes, but states he cannot tell Jon and he must see what the future holds for himself. The series comes to a close as Jon sits on the Iron Throne, his future set in stone ahead of him, but, like the viewer, his fate and the fate of the citizens of the Seven Kingdoms unknown. Holy fuck. Well, that's it, y'all. We got through all 18 godforsaken episodes of Game of Thrones Rewrite. Of course, there is the finale where we'll put it all together, something I want to release later in the year, as it will take a while to put it all together, but let me just say thank you for joining me on this project, which has taken over a whole year to complete, but one which has been an absolute blast. When I began this series, it really was not a matter of just wanting to rewrite the series to my own liking, but rather to show that all of those who had said people were just upset that the show did not end the way they wanted, well, that wasn't it at all. Many of you have given your own takes and theories, all of which are brilliant in their own right. This rewrite was simply one version of how it could have turned out. My biggest gripe with the way the showrunners ended the show was not that I didn't like the way they did it, it's that I think we all got a sense that they just stopped caring and trying and sort of called it in for the final season. Many have said, it's just a TV show, get over it. But as someone who has a passion for storytelling, a passion that has gotten me through a lot of tough times, it was heartbreaking to see a series I loved be discarded as something insignificant, even by some people who had claimed to be passionate about it. And it was both sad and yet comforting to know there were many others out there, you beautiful bastards included, who had a similar passion for the series and the characters and were heartbroken to see it end on such a sour and careless note. I have read theories and character analysis from comments from accounts that have 2 subscribers that I was absolutely blown away by, and showed an incredible insight into character and theme. If you are someone who doesn't think your own stories are worth telling, just take a look at the comments on any one of the rewrite episodes to see that you don't need to write for a big publication or have a YouTube channel with 500,000 subscribers or a multi-million-dollar show deal to be a good storyteller. Write your book, your screenplay, start a YouTube channel, just say fuck it and know your stories are worth telling and deserve to exist somewhere besides your own thoughts. And thank you for supporting this channel as it has allowed me to do just that. In the meantime, if you are looking to talk about story ideas and collaborate with others, my new Discord channel has places to discuss writing, to give each other tips and strategies, and to share work. There is also a dedicated channel for discussion regarding the endowment of our favorite fantasy fellas. As I said, the rewrite finale will probably come out late in the year. I have a number of other videos coming out until then and into the future that I am excited to share with y'all. But for now, this marks the end of the Game of Thrones Rewrite series. Thank you all for your incredible support and encouragement, and I'll see you next time.